I'm from Colorado State, and today we're just here to briefly kind of provoke some discussion with everyone about what we think about when we visualize data, when we think about rhetorical activity. How do we make choices about visualization? So we have a number of panelists. A couple of them, unfortunately, were not able to be physically present with us due to unforeseen circumstances that arose. So myself, I'll be presenting. Donnie Johnson Saki.
Yeah, that's fine.
From Wayne State, Laura Grease from Florida, the University of Florida, Brian McNeely from the University of Kentucky, and Ryan Omizo from the University of Rhode Island. All have presented, prepared brief lightning-style talks to share with you today. And we'll begin with the digital remote presenters first. So we'll start with Brian McNeely's.
Hi everyone, Brian McNeely from the University of Kentucky. I want to explore how we might broaden data.
Awesome.
Starting out strong.
Let's try that again.
Try refreshing the page.
Yeah, I think that's probably a smart choice. Of course. Now what?
Go to guest.
Yeah, we were on guest, I thought.
No, you're not.
Oh, you just get feed the guest, or what do we do?
Yeah, we just
All
hit
right.
it.
Yeah, it's just switched to now. Get a guess.
I do agree. Thank you. All right. Cool.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian McNeely from the University of Kentucky. I want to explore how we might broaden data visualization by narrowing our focus a bit. In other words, instead of visualizing massive data sets, I'll consider what we might gain by visualizing qualitative data. So let's begin with the brief fieldwork story. Over a final year of college, Valerie, a journalism graphics major, worked with an interdisciplinary team of 25 other students on a project carried out in conjunction with the preeminent public museum in their state. I conducted 10 months of ethnographic fieldwork, tracing the collaborative writing work of Valerie, her interdisciplinary student colleagues, and their professors and community partners. In an interview with Valerie near the end of the project, we had the following exchange. As you can see, Valerie's perception about what constitutes writing is skewed, but also commonplace. Writing is the stuff that happens in formal, official genres, essays, papers, books, and letters. This kind of writing is clearly not her thing as a graphic designer. But Valerie did say she made many lists, and luckily she kept these bits of not quite writing. I asked if she'd share them with me at the end of the project, and she agreed, and I also knew that Valerie did more than just listing, especially in digital genres. By visualizing some of Valerie's not quite writing, we may explore the role of writing in her knowledge-making in new and hopefully interesting ways. Indeed, what we see here is the actual writing that Valerie did as part of her project, and this doesn't include many thousand other words produced across digital genres. Despite not seeing herself as a writer, Valerie's inventional and coordinative practices in graphic design were strongly mediated by an impressive array of written artifacts and tools. By visualizing this data, her writing is brought into relief. Over the last few years, my fieldwork has consistently included visual methods of research to deepen understandings and presentations of systemic material contexts and the ways they mediate writing. Such methods help me visualize qualitative data in robust ways, a technique that supports intersubjective understandings among research participants and broader presentations of their situated practice, what Linda Brodkey might call new pictures of writers and writing. These approaches attempt to visually document and promote understanding of the social processes of participants. Developed in anthropology and sociology, such methods typically involve photography, videography, or participant drawing. As methods, photography and videography are ways of investigating the complex collaborative phenomena that mediate practice in a given field site. Such methods, however, may be deployed with a variety of methodological approaches. In other words, visual methods may be guided by a variety of theories, values, and aims that support one's investigations. and they may therefore be deployed from a number of methodological perspectives to support researchers in many different fields. In my own discipline of rhetoric and writing, all too often the visuals we use are tautological. They merely illustrate and support overwhelmingly discursive arguments, and videos, if used at all, are often turned into transcripts and treated like texts. There's not necessarily anything wrong with these methods, but I suggest we build on them, tapping into the potential of visual phenomena to create typologies, to value context in new ways, to compare across cases, and to create new forms of scholarly resonance in published work. Visual methods, for example, may yield simultaneous rather than sequential forms of fieldwork data. They may provide granular insights about the systemic material context of communicative practices for both researchers and participants. And they may provide more high-line reporting and presentation of qualitative fieldwork, where so much data is often obfuscated by the limits of our traditional publication venues and genres. One of our recent projects, for example, included 135 different figures, allowing us to share so much more about our research site than we could in discursive forms alone. As Helen Liggett argues, photography may promote active engagement with the material of the world in mutually generative processes. Visualizing qualitative data, in other words, may promote sites of participatory reading and understanding among researchers and participants, among researchers and audiences, and among participants and audiences. And these potentials extend from the researcher-participant relationship to the broader public dissemination of qualitative work. In short, visual methods may open new avenues of understanding and foster new ways of sharing dense qualitative data that is all too often omitted or reduced in final reporting of fieldwork. One final benefit: when performed systematically and rigorously, we can scale up qualitative data so that it's amenable to fruitful cross-case comparisons.
We have, this is from Ryan Omizo.
Thank you and welcome to Visualizing Computational Rhetoric. My name is Ryan Omizo from the University of Rhode Island. Just one note before I get started: some of these slides have been created for offline readers and have notes as well. Now, by computational rhetoric, I mean rhetorical analysis that is assisted by computerized algorithms. Now, there are many different algorithms that can be deployed for these purposes. I will be focusing on machine learning as a sort of problem for this talk, and how machine learning can be used to classify rhetorical moves for an ongoing project of mine. That project is the Faciloscope, which is an extension of a previous wide project which examined how human facilitators foster conversations in online learning environments. You can follow the link in the slide to read more about it. It's also been written about in various journals as well. The authors are included in the slide notes. Part of this project was focused on isolating high-value facilitation techniques as rhetorical moves in the swales in the jar sense of a mood that advances persuasion or conversation. Now, the Faciloscope was designed to automatically classify large chunks of discourse according to 3 high-value facilitation moves, and they're here on the slide. Staging, inviting, and evoking relationships with examples. Now, very quickly, staging is a move that often offers a description or an introduction of an idea or a concept. An inviting move, which is a very high-valued move, is a move that explicitly guides or fosters the development of conversation or an idea. Question is a very typical inviting move in this particular project. And then the evoking relationships move. These are moves that facilitate and encourage social harmony or connections among participants, or even dissensus among participants. So, for example, a thank you move. Thanks for sharing that really great point, Tim, is a typical evoking relationships move. Now, the problem or provocation for this project and this panel, I think, boils down to this. Now, annotating an input text, a natural language text, with descriptions of rhetorical moves, the Faciloscope expands the original data set, makes it bigger. So now, how can we visualize this expansion of data while also making use of the condensation of information that visuals are routinely obliged to offer? So what I propose for this talk is an approach guided by certain key theorists like Stephen Bernhardt and Bill Hart-Davidson, is to approach computational rhetorical outputs that view text information as an assemblage of different objects that collaborate to form certain views of the information. And the challenge is to understand the new affordances and constraints that qualitative, computational, resolutions or outputs can offer qualitative rhetorical judgment. Now, one path along this object-oriented approach is through the use of small multiples, made famous by Tufte. And here are some examples of traditional small multiples. First, we have a pie chart or a donut chart that shows percent distributions of the 3 rhetorical moves. We also have a bar chart that shows the frequency counts of rhetorical moves, staging, evoking, and inviting, per sentence at the sentence level. And here we have a small multiple that I created while trying to negotiate the quantitative counts of rhetorical moves and the density of the original text. So we call this the bands visualization. The bands illustrate the spatial dimensions and arrangement of each of the 3 rhetorical moves used in this project. We sort of think of this as a DNA smear of a particular text that's been inputted. Now, to make the bands visualization or any of these visualizations more useful to analysts or to other end users, perhaps facilitators, we've also introduced an interactional component. So, for example, here's a live look at the oscilloscope and the bands visualization here described as a move pattern. And what we can now do, because we have this crystallized look at a particular view of this text, we can now use that view to negotiate with the actual original part of the text in different ways that could hopefully provide more insight. So we can see this band and the distribution of different moves. We can then zoom in onto particular moves or whatever sort of pattern or arrangement that seems most interesting. The green is staging, the purple is inviting. So we want to focus on the inviting moves here in this particular swatch of text. We can zoom in and move, and we can have it outputted here so that we can see what exactly is going on as we have this more general overview of move distributions. Now I want to end this talk with one final provocation, and that is that the theorizing and implementation of visual data in digital humanities or computational rhetoric projects should consider app development as part of its theoretical and practical scaffolding. Now, speaking about the oscilloscope specifically, it wasn't until the late stages of app development that the bands visualization was proposed. And it was only proposed because the existing framework and the current visual design made it feasible and plausible. Now, whether or not this bands visualization will be part of the final outcome, I think that is a separate question. But what is key here is that the development process in these types of projects can feed and inform complex and novel theorizations. And here are the references that I used for the creation of this presentation. You can access this PowerPoint on my website, ryan/omiso.com, for the full list of references and also notes for the slides. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Super. You can.
Want me to pull it up too?
Yeah. Are you gonna stay there?
No.
Yeah. Perfect. That's what I'm saying. I'll just like tap my finger. All right. So what I want to do today is focus on the problems of mapping environmental justice hotspots within urban settings. Specifically, I want to pivot towards understanding the rhetorical work of these technologies and their material effects in the world as a means of thinking of alternative technological interventions that would better engage with complexity to help shape environmental policy. For me, the problem of mapping manifests as both process and product. By process, I'm inquiring as to what types of questions do we ask or should we ask when determining what data should be collected for future purposes. With product, I'm asking for us to think critically about how we curate and design the data into meaningful chunks for use by a variety of stakeholders. These critical moments of composition serve as potential opportunities for empowerment, wherein people can assess risks for themselves as opposed to allowing others to make those decisions for them. It wasn't until the late 1950s that the environmental movement began to alert people to the dangers of industrial pollution. At that time, impacts upon people's health were not generally acknowledged or thought to be spatially or socially differentiated. Everyone was presumed to be just about equally affected. I say this to underscore the fact that the idea of environmental injustice, or the idea that race and class could be used as factors to predict disproportional impact, did not enter the national discussion until the late 1980s. With the last decade, as there have been improvements with GIS technologies, researchers have increasingly turned towards mapping to document and determine the extent of environmental injustice. Yet what's lacking in the current moment is a need to ask specific rhetorical questions regarding mapping techniques, the products they create, and the rhetorical effects that they have when we distribute them. Although maps often are presented as objective representations of space, we know they're social constructions. These documents are often embedded with our own goals and tacit biases. Thus, representations of environmental injustice are often prone to the same critical analyses as climate or topographic maps. The provocations I'd like to raise surround rhetorical networks we use to build maps and subsequently policy-related arguments. These are largely measures that we use to make arguments about disproportional impact, which is the basis of any environmental justice argument, and an argument that often fails at the level of data. These measures include whether race or class are better predictors of injustice, what counts as a hazard, how can we determine potential exposure, and how do we measure exposure. Then there are issues of data collection and sharing. There are either not enough monitoring sites or we fail to incorporate community members into monitoring networks, which would increase the types of data that's available. And when we do have data, we fail to engage at several levels of literacy. In total, these are definitional, conceptual, methodological, and data-driven problems. They're also rhetorical problems, and they necessitate deep deliberation because they enable citizens to accomplish important knowledge work. So for the purpose of time, I want to dwell on the definitional level and focus on a single measure. EJ activists have consistently argued that hazardous waste sites have been located near poor people of color's communities. It's an argument that has not changed, and for very good reasons. For many, removing the racial element entirely would take away from the very real fact that environmental justice has always had a tight historical relationship with environmental racism. But to what extent can we always use race or class as indicators of environmental injustice? As easy as this might sound, the findings of many environmental justice studies are in conflict on this very point. Some clearly show race as a determining variable by controlling for income, still finding disproportionate burdens on minorities, whereas other studies control for race and find that income is more statistically a significant variable in determining disproportionate environmental burdens. Let's switch those around, sorry. And although attempts to map injustice via GIS have demonstrated a positive relationship between either race or economics and injustice, such attempts are not without their critiques. The fact of the matter is that there is a nonlinear relationship between proximity to hazardous waste sites and income level. Critics of EJ activists often point to the fact that these facilities are normally located in working class neighborhoods rather than poor or affluent neighborhoods. The rationalization here is that the poorest communities have so little economic activity that they're too poor to attract types of facilities, and that most affluent neighborhoods have more than enough capital to fight. Furthermore, arguments concerning injustice using race or economics never account for migration purposes. And this is important because in fighting claims of disproportionate impact in issues of siting, companies and government agencies often conduct longitudinal studies that map population characteristics surrounding noxious facilities. If they can prove that minorities came to an area before the facility was constructed, there's no discriminatory intent. Race, when mapped in these ways, is largely decontextualized. To map injustice, we flatten data, which makes it difficult for us to see certain types of arguments. The problem here is the way in which we use race as a determiner doesn't address the complexity in which we've come to understand race through theory. What we should make visible is the concept of race operates on many levels to influence the potential of exposure to environmental hazards and disease. In fact, geographer Julia Monte has argued that race is often a proxy for conditions that pose risks or exacerbate exposures. It's really the context of race rather than race itself that's meaningful, but often gets obscured. Although race and income are the most prevalent indicators in selection of what constitutes disproportional impact in environmental justice mapping initiatives. They should not be the only variables. There are other indicators of vulnerability such as linguistic isolation, education level, and age that we often should take into combination to make maps that help us make the types of arguments that should drive policy.
You want to just click and I'll just do it?
Click and stand.
Yeah, you want to just click, Tim, and I'll just do what Don did? So switch?
Yeah, go ahead.
He was realistic.
All right, so I'll just go with it. There are a lot. You can probably see the bold, but I'll click. Okay. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for being here. So my talk today is called Visualizing Viral Circulation. For the last 7 years, I've been tracing the rhetorical life of a single image, which emerged in this design produced by Shepard Fairey back in 2008. For my original study, I invented a digital research method called iconographic tracking to discover how the Obama Hope image went viral, experienced mass transformation, and became iconic within a short year, as well as discover what kinds of contributions it's made to collective life since the 2008 presidential election season. In addition to the strategies of tracing, following, and describing borrowed from actor network theory, this approach uses data visualization to analyze research findings. So often, data visualization is used to depict one's final research findings. But because of data visualization's abilities to help identify previously unidentified trends and patterns, map out complex relations, and open up new research paths, I've been trying to use it during the research process to help broaden and deepen my study of visual rhetoric. As a scholar invested in circulation studies and committed to mapping out the networked complexity of visual rhetoric, I'm particularly curious about how working with large data sets and digital visualizations might enhance our scholarly practices. Current scholarship with cultural analytics is already making headway into the visualization of pictorial data. Lev Manovich in the Software Studies Initiative, for instance, has produced a free software tool called ImagePlot that helps discover patterns in large collections of paintings, films, animations, and other moving data. For scholars interested in design and style, ImagePlot is useful because it helps, among other things, detect subtle differences among pictures and represent minute variations in terms of color, pitch, grayscale, etc. But as far as I can tell, and I've tried to play with ImagePlot, I don't think it's easy to play with, but I don't think it's useful in making visible a single image's widespread circulation and distributed collective activities, which are of my main concern. As I discuss in my recently published book, forgive the shameless plug, many images such as Obama Hope are what Euro Engstrom, forgive me if I'm butchering his name, calls runaway objects. Things that may start out as insignificant innovations, yet quickly escalate beyond anyone's control and end up having far-reaching and unexpected side effects on a global scale. Besides becoming a national symbol here in the United States, for instance, Obama Hope has become, among other things, a popular advertising strategy, a touchstone for copyright and fair use debates, a popular commodity, and a multifaceted, and a transnational activist across the world. If we are interested in recovering the ongoing travels and multifaceted global impact of a runaway object such as Obama Hope, then, what visualization technologies and strategies are at our disposal to do such work? How do we depict how viral images circulate in a nonlinear fashion, emerge in divergent activities, and transform in non-sequential manners across the globe? And most importantly, how do we create such visualizations in such a way that opens up new research possibilities? These are the methodological questions that I'm presently grappling with. In efforts to address these questions, I've been experimenting with a variety of interactive digital maps, such as Google Maps, geographical heat maps, temporal bar graphs, and network maps that seem well equipped to visualize Obama Hope's dynamic and networked dimensions. These maps rely on metadata I've begun to generate by coding 1,000 pictures that document Obama Hope's circulation, transformation, and collective activities since 2008. To develop this metadata, I've been using iconographic tracking to generate what Cheryl Ball, Therese Graben, and Michelle Seidler would call a boutique data set. Smaller data sets based on quantitative and qualitative research that have proven useful to our own research projects but currently are inaccessible to other researchers. To easily export this data set for data visualizations, I've been entering my data into a Google spreadsheet in order to leverage Google Fusion Tables, an open source app that enables researchers who don't have much computer science background to upload, organize, query, and share data sets. And I do want to say that I'm working with a computer programmer. I really am pretty illiterate when it comes to this stuff. But what I do know is that with Google Fusion Data, different APIs can programmatically be queried, and the results can be data mined at real time to create more advanced and custom data visualizations. This provides the advantage that all maps, charts, and graphs contained within my collection immediately reflect any changes and additions to the data set. So for this project, I thus created a Google Fusion table with multiple columns in which I record the URLs that capture Obama Hope's materialization, but also the metadata and the categories you see here. The data in this Google Fusion table feeds directly into a series of maps and graphs that are helping me visualize not only all the places where Obama Hope has been, but also how it has evolved in terms of rhetorical function, which genres it has most been deployed in, and among other things, notice gaps in research and identify new research targets. So for instance, when I first, this was pretty early on in the research process, I was able to tell where I didn't have any data that Obama Hope was showing up. So then I was able to go do more targeted researches. And so for instance, in India, I was like, okay, well, hasn't Obama Hope surely has showed up in India? Mm-hmm. And that allowed me to actually discover some protests that it has been involved in. So these visualizations are still very much in production. But I just want to show you a couple. So if you click just on the slide still. So for instance, one of the things that I'm doing is all the data will show up, the geographical locations will show up, and then if you click, when you click on one of those red dots, the metadata will come up so you can see the picture and then you can see all the metadata. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm working on a web text, hopefully for Kairos, where I'm talking about the methodology, I'm talking about the coding, and then I'll have all the maps up there so people can play with the data too. But the real thing that I'm grappling with is, getting back to circulation. How do you show how something that travels in nonlinear ways and at really high speeds, how do you show that? So this is where we need to go out. So what I've come up with is this spatiotemporal heat map, or what my computer programmer has come up with. And so when you click on it, you can see everything, where it's popped up from 2008. And this data, I've only done about 850 images so far, and I'm not sure this data reflects even all of those. But what's interesting is you can see how it slows down and speeds up. And so, for instance, back in 2012, you'll see it speeding back up in the United States, and that's because of the 2012 presidential election where it came back into play. So it's, so this is the best I can do so far to help me, to help visualize viral circulation. Because all of these data visualizations are still very much in the process, I don't really have any conclusions to draw today, but I guess quite selfishly, I'm wondering what you might suggest for how we might continue to visualize a phenomenon that is becoming more and more frequent in our globally networked culture. Where do we go from here, in other words, as we begin to visualize visual rhetoric circulating and transforming all around us? Thanks so much.
Tough act to follow.
Oh.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming. I'm Tim Amadon again. So I'd like to talk a little bit about literacy today, and specifically, this impacts my experiences understanding literacy in an embodied way as a firefighter as well as an academic. And so my perceptions of literacy have been shaped not only through writing studies, but also through the work I've done in the fire service. And the two main things that I've taken away from these experiences is that communities value literacies disproportionately. The second thing is that those decisions have consequences. Mike Rose says that our cultural iconography promotes the muscled arm, sleeve rolled tight against biceps, but no brightness behind the eye, no image that links hand and brain. And generally speaking, a lot of research from within my field, while we do like to try to get into the workplace and do those types of studies, we have a less robust understanding of blue-collar understandings of literacy and mechanical understandings of literacy. Cindy Self argues that the almost exclusive dominance of print literacy works against the interests of individuals whose cultures and communities have managed to maintain a value on multiple modalities of expression, multiple and hybrid ways of knowing, communicating, and establishing identity. And that statement really tracks with my identity, understanding the different ways that people construct and talk about literacy both within the fire service and in higher education. So the visualizations I'm going to share today come from a study that I created using a heuristic research methodology. One of those kind of camps of thought that I pulled from was community-based research approaches. Jeff Grable says that community-based approaches ask us how do people do work on their own terms and in their own interests. And I really wanted to privilege that. And so I don't have enough time to really talk about all of that under the hood methodology choices that I went through, but I do want to touch on that. And so I also pulled from multimodal and digital ethnography and used some of the same sources that McNeely was kind of like gesturing towards in his presentation. And also my research is informed by writing activity and genre research, as Russell and Spinuzzi have called it. For about the past decade, Spinuzzi, Hart-Davidson, Zachary, and other Wagger scholars have been looking at mediational genres and not just communicative genres. So we've turned to looking at the less visible, non-transactional ways that folks communicate and how those genres bring to bear. And so McNeely's presentation did a really good job of showing some of that work that goes on behind the scenes that we don't tend to look at. So one of the things I noticed in my study was that there was a lot of interesting ways to visualize that activity. And I had used a range of methods, including photography, videography, thermal imaging, to study firefighters in live fire situations, and also interviewing. So I gathered and traced genres in different ways using those methods. And each method showed or depicted a different aspect of that work activity. One showed some work, and some other method showed some other aspect of work. And what my argument ultimately is that by kind of layering those methods, we can create a richer visualization of what's going on. So here's some ways that we've tried to look at the ways that writing and visualize the way that writing works. We've looked at the activity system. This comes from Spinuzzi's work in 2004. This is a communicative event model. So it shows the sequential, ways that genre 1 impacts genre 2 to genre 3. And we understand writing in this linear fashion. Genre ecology model that Spinuzzi's developed offers a different view of how writing occurs. This non-sequential, but also, there's also limitations, right? And one of those limitations is that in focusing in maybe more knowledge work or white collar occupations, we're not building the tools and we don't have the apparatus to study the ways that folks in other professions also do knowledge work, or the knowledge work that might be found in blue collar literacy. So Spinuzzi argues that genres are used in assemblages and complexes. So I've really, kind of embraced that, and I said, well, what do these assemblages look like? And so pulling in multimodality, I've started to look at what are all the types of genres that I saw on the fire scene. And there's things like that people wear, like these fire shields. There's some semiotic markers in this, such as like the white demonstrates that this is an officer's shield. The Rescue 6 talks about the type of work that that unit would do. The 6 becomes an identifier. There's also a little Spartan guy down there, the Martian man, and that they use as part of their like icon. And so this is another image from a patch that they have, and that's gold leafing on one of the actual apparatus that the company utilizes. But I also saw things like this, like a command post. And this is probably more traditionally what we'd go and look at, right? We have different types of genres. We have written genres. We have this board that's used for tracking personnel. We have multiple radios due to the multiple types of work that are going on this scene. We have accountability. We have multiple pens. We have cigarettes and all sorts of things that are part of this person's genre ecology. We also have more structured command systems, such as this magnetic board that has magnets and timers and predetermined heuristic categories that a commander can use to help manage the work that we're doing. These are the more traditional genres that we would look to and talk about. But there's also things like this. And so that is a video of a search team performing a primary search during a live fire evolution. And what you can hear is not only the talking, but also the tapping that's going on, the tools dragging. There's ambient genres going on that not only are doing, but a knowledge construction. The person at the door banging the axe is serving as a reference point for the other workers that says, like, here's your entry point into this room. Beyond like also the touch when they're feeling the walls that you're seeing, they're also creating knowledge of spatial location based on that. So they have multiple reference points to navigate through the space, which is difficult to navigate through due to the lack of sight. So I've seen a number of genres in these spaces, and I've started to create other types of visualizations that I can share with you. That kind of map the interrelationships of these, kind of like how Lori has as well. And there's different views that we can take. We can take a scene view, and you see that there's things like discursive genres that, all that purple in this bottom half of this visualization. None of those things appear on a fire scene, yet they have a very, very important and powerful impact on the work that gets done there. But there's also these other things that go on, like a diesel engine in the background. We might just discount that as a genre, but that's something that if you're inside a building, you can listen to. You can say, okay, I know that engine was parked on this side of the house. Or I know, like, if I go towards that engine, I could get outside of the building. I wouldn't be going deeper into the building. So it's a way of creating knowledge and navigating. And so there's different views, the scene view, agent view, and when you start to combine them, you have really rich understandings of activity. And so those are my references. And so now we'd like to turn to a discussion about what types of provocations that these raise for all of you and help us to guide our thinking forward. Yes.
Those are fantastic presentations, and I'm not just saying that to make the ritual relationship with you. They're outstanding. I wondered if I could sort of direct a general question more specifically to my colleague, Donnie Saki. Donnie, and just for context with everybody, Donnie's speaking next week at the Science Conference in Bethesda at the National Institutes for Humanities. This is loaded with science and technology and social science folks working on complex problem solving. In contrast to the past, where a lot of our conferences have been loaded with academics, there's going to be a huge percentage of folks from the funding agencies, particularly NIH, NSF, people who give money for scientific research. I have worked for years as a member of the programming committee, often to no avail, to get more humanities perspectives. And what I'm so powerfully struck by in your presentation is the importance of folks in that audience thinking about specific examples, such as the one you're presenting, the Pet Coke example in Detroit, but also more generally why thinking about discourse, rhetoric, and following new literacy are just fundamentally crucial to how we conceptualize what we're going to prioritize as the problems that are not only worth working on together collaboratively, but funding.
Right. I think that so part of what I'm talking about today actually branched off of an additional project that emerged from this research team that I've been working on for the past 2 years. And what we've been doing as a group is we've been working on the petroleum coke issue in Southwest Detroit. And what petroleum coke essentially is, it's a byproduct of Alberta tar sands. And it's been shipped out of Canada, but they were basing it or storing it, trying to store it permanently on a Detroit River down in Southwest Detroit. What's been happening is that these piles, they're huge piles, have been uncovered. And so when we have a wind event, it would essentially blow the dust throughout neighborhoods and across the river into Windsor, Canada. One of the things that we didn't know was the environmental impacts of it and the human health impacts. And we had a bunch of residents who were complaining, and they came to some folks at the university and said, you know, we need to figure out what this is. And so that's how that team assembled. Now, what the team was designed to do, it's designed to be sort of a response mechanism to sort of citizen-initiated environmental problems. So that's really how we function. What I can say that's been really valuable about it in terms of what Julie has been talking about is we have a group of people who essentially in a lot of ways have been siloed off into their individual disciplines and coming together realizing that the only way that we can sort of solve these problems that are essentially complex is to sort of rely upon the levels of expertise of people from other places, to sort of think about what a humanities perspective might bring to a science-related problem. With this particular example that I was talking about today, it emerged out of a discussion with the environmental engineer who's on our team, Sean McLamary, over some maps that I was looking at. And I'd asked him some questions, and I said, well, can we use these maps to argue for these particular circumstances or these particular things? And essentially what he said is, the system's not designed this way. It's not designed this way in terms to visualize it, but it's not designed this way in the sense that no one in the beginning ever asked that question before they designed the system, or ever asked that question when we're thinking about collecting data, right? So naturally, one of the things that I've loved is that having different people come together has been incredibly generative for building different types of projects that I think are really useful, not necessarily just to university folks, but also for community members as well. I don't know if that got at what you were like aiming at, Julie.
Well, it's a great example, thank you.
I'll ask you a question.
All right.
What software program are you using to create your visualizations?
I'm using, it's called data-driven, D3, data-driven documents. And it's a JavaScript language that works within HTML. And then a lot of it's just CSS tweaking for the style. And I'm working on Cairo's article based on this too. You know.
Those are the same things driving that is in Faciloscope too, is D3.
D3.
Yeah, I think part of what the challenge is how do we create visualizations that are capable of being as rich as the activity we see, right? Like, that's definitely one of the limitations I see in like the research is like when we have to translate it to a print-based like genre, you're losing so much in that translation, and it's like, how do you keep the orality? How do you keep the visual frames? And how do you, you know, because we do so much of our reading through visual frames, there's no way for me to like capture that heat or the smell of the smoke and shoot that through a computer to a reader, right? To experience that embodied perspective of how those things impact literacy work. But those things are part of the activity, and so we can at least visualize it and account for it. It's better than like a one-dimensional map, but we're still, you know, adding on features. And so I think that's, you know, with your project as well, I see like, you know, an attempt to how do we reach into these new affordances of digital writing technologies to capture the research and the activity and represent it.
Well, and I think the question is, how far do you go? Like, I've been trying to do that complex, you know, the network mapping. And I mean, okay, I'm just so illiterate when it comes to this stuff. So I started out with just using a basic bubble-us map that I made, you know, I attached URLs to, and now I'm looking for a different program to use. But, you know, if I mapped out, I mean, really taking an actor network theory approach, if I map out all the characters, I mean, it takes so much time for me to just create that one complex map that has only just a small fraction of the players. And so part of the frustration for me when I'm creating it and spending hours doing this thing is like, who is really going to click on any of these? Who is really interested in this more than me? And so the question for me becomes, is this worth it? And I think that's a really important question that we have to ask as we delve into these data visualizations. And that's really kind of the really general question that I'm using for my web text. Like, is this worth our time? I don't know.
Yes, I have about Obama a question and a remark. And so the question has to do with what I read just yesterday. The news that Shepard Fairey is disappointed in how the Obama administration has conducted itself over the last 8 years. And I wondered if you had any reaction to that. And then the remark has to do with what we're just talking about now, namely the spatio-temporal display of information. And when you started talking about the word viral, I started thinking about the spread of infectious disease. There are games such as Plague Incorporated on the iOS platform that do a reasonable job because when you're playing the game, it's really more a puzzle than a game. You have to get that information in real time as quickly as possible. And you have to click on different graphs and on different maps. So games might be a place to look for how to visualize that.
Yeah, I don't, what's interesting, I can't believe I'm still working with the Obama Hope. I'm looking at Bill Hart Davidson. I'm like, I remember when you saw me present on Obama Hope at Computers and Writings like 7 years ago. It's like, I'm still working with this damn image. And I know people are so tired of me talking about it, but there's...
I read your book the other day and earlier in the semester. Great.
Oh, thank you.
Really great.
Oh, thank you. Well, anyway, but there's just so many rich questions. There's so much more to do with it. Like, I'm still learning so much from it, like with this visualization project in one respect. But I'm also thinking about, because I've had so much interest in the image from people who are not in the academy, that I'm thinking of creating a documentary about it. And that's where there's some stuff that comes out in the case study in the book, and I'm trying to expand that into a full-length documentary or kind of full-length rhetorical biography of the image, because I think that's an interesting genre. Like, what happens if we start to tell the rhetorical life of things, right? What would that look like? But so in the documentary, I want to maybe interview Fairey, because now I have his attention since I wrote an entire book about his damn image. So I want to ask him these questions. And I know that there are a lot of other artists who were involved in the Obama art movement who feel kind of duped about it, and they haven't had a chance to speak about that yet. So that's kind of some of the work I want to bring out in the documentary. But yeah, the games is interesting. I have no experience with video games, but that's why it's so important for me to work with computer programmers and other people who are more savvy. And I'm constantly just asking people for ideas, because I really am clueless about all of this.
Can I ask you a practical question? How did you find the
a friend. He's not even in the humanities. He's a friend of mine in Portland, and what's really great about the project that he's working on is that his work with my project allowed him to get his data visualization job. And so he's continuing to work with me, but unfortunately I've run out of grant money, so now I'm looking to write a new grant to help support the work.
Well, from Twitter, do you all have a place where all of these are living? Do you have a little spot, a link?
I do, but mine is closed right now because hopefully Kairos will publish it and then it will go live. But I don't want to make it live until it's finished because I'm still creating those Google Fusion tables, and so the data is constantly changing. But the interesting question is, am I really going to keep tracing this image forever? I don't know. I've got to stop sometime. So the question is, well, what happens if I made it so that other people could contribute to the data set and they could, I don't know how that would work, but that's something that interests me.
Yeah, that open, the crowdsourcing that work.
Right, and also to take that notion of the boutique data sets, kind of seriously, in that there's a whole lot of, I have so much data, right? I'm coding 1,000 pictures. Somebody else could ask totally different questions from that data.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting from Donnie's talk. I mean, you were talking about really adding dimensionality to these kinds of mapping projects, which would allow someone to work with a similar data set, but to put parallel metadata and answer some other questions.
Right.
And the EPA, if anybody's interested in pursuing this further, the EPA just, they've been working on this for the past, I want to say 7 years, and they just deployed this as of 2 weeks ago, and they had 3 scheduled webinars on it. There was one yesterday, and there was one 2 weeks ago, and there's another one that's coming up, I believe on June 3rd. I believe it's June 3rd. But it's a new mapping tool called EJ Screen. And what EJ Screen was supposed to do was supposed to sort of bypass what we've been using for quite some time, which is known as the TRI, or the Toxic Release Inventory. So if you're not familiar with the Toxic Release Inventory, it's a site on EPA where essentially you can go and type in your address and your zip code, and what it'll do is it'll bring up a map that has all of the different polluters within your area. Now the problem with that is that's largely a regulatory database. So you're only going to see known polluters. If you pull up Detroit on there, it's not going to have any information about any of the trucks that are idling on the bridge to Canada. It'll have lots of stuff about the River Rouge complex. It'll have lots of stuff about the incinerator, but those other known polluters that are outside of a regulatory environment aren't going to be on there. Now, what EJ Screen was supposed to do is it was supposed to add a little bit more dimension to the types of data sets that we have. The problem with that is that some of the data that's used on there is super old. So the National Air Toxic Assessment data, that's from 2005. So it's not even remotely recent, so they've pulled that out. But they have other data sets that are from 2008 to 2013. The issue with that is that still a lot of that stuff is still siloed off. So it's not even tapping into other regulatory databases like the EIA, which is a power plant database, or WQX, which is known as the Water Quality Exchange, because that's only member-oriented. So you have to be a member in order to access that database. But it is a government database, right? So the problem is that even though the EPA has created this new tool that's still in beta form, it still has the same sort of problems that all these other tools that they've had in the past have.
I have a similar problem with a side project that's related to this project that I'm working on too, with firefighter line of duty death and occupational injury. And there's different databases where they're capturing information on that. And then the main database is NIFRS, which is the National Fire Incident Reporting System. And they don't, they use the autopsy. There's a national protocol for autopsies in the fire service. And there's only 9 codes that they use for line of duty death reporting. And so those codes are all proximal to the moment you actually die. So you can be in a building and something can fall on you, and so it's gonna be a collapse death, right? But you could have missed 5 messages, or you could have said like, oh, we see the victim, we have to go get them. And so there's like communicative and rhetorical issues that impact decision making that like we're not capturing in that database, but there's other databases like the near miss database that the International Association of Fire Chiefs is collecting, that, you know, if we pull them together and like cross weave this data set, you get a richer picture of what's going on. But it's just so siloed, and so you get these really like partial views of like what's going on and contributing to line of duty death or injury, and it's pretty problematic. So I think that's such like one of the central issues of this type of work right now.
And I'm sorry. I was going to say, one of the things that I do want to add to it is with this sort of question of adding dimensionality to data, is that so our regulatory environment with respect to following like particulate air matter or like releases from power plants or other types of polluters only requires plants to report to the state government on a quarterly basis. Now, what blew my mind is most of these plants are literally monitoring their air releases on a minute-by-minute basis, right? So what we only see like a quarterly report, like what's been like sort of released within the span of a couple months. But if that data showing like literally an hour in a day over the course of several days were available, that could totally change the types of like, you know, work that researchers do, or even the types of like policies that get written. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping is if we get smarter about like making these arguments about like visualizing certain things, that we can actually change the regulatory environment.
Just a comment, one of the things I think ties these together in a really fascinating way, and it's certainly something that Ryan and I thought a lot about with the band's visualization, is we're trying to think about ways to allow researchers to zoom in when they need to see the richness of the rhetorical act in its lived situation. I think that's the case with everybody. But you don't want to also lose the sense of scale, especially when you have something like what Laurie is tracing, where it's literally a global phenomenon, or as Donnie's saying, where it's continuous data is what we think about rather than discrete data. So it's like monitoring someone's blood pressure. The error comes in when you measure, and as a continuous measure, you have to be mindful that that's where you're likely to make your biggest errors in interpretation, is if you take if you treat a continuous measure as a discrete measure. So I think you all are really doing a nice job of developing some kind of basic visual vocabularies for this in this panel that I haven't seen pulled together before, how to zoom in and out. Even McNeely going up in the rafters and shooting the basketball court.
Right.
He was playing with scale there to try to see if he could see a pattern, which is pretty cool.
All right.
Actually, I'm after you.
All right.
Sure. Well, I had a question, but your thought made me like the real-time reporting. It's almost like taking that agile software development, wanting to reporting, putting out releases. But I was going to ask Obama Hope if I'm really interested in the idea of layers, of pulling in different layers and trying to see crude correlations. I wonder if in the course of your time with it, you've seen other things traveling along with it, or
oh my gosh,
so much, or if it's hard to kind of generalize that way.
There's so much I could trace out,
right.
Because I mean you have remixes of Obama Hope that have themselves begun to circulate on broad scale. So you have like that Joker, that socialist Joker one. And then lately, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the Twitter really racist responses to Obama's Twitters, and then you had the Rope Obamacon. And people are like, oh, they're emailing, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a Obamacon, which is, the digital style of the Obama Hope poster, and it has a noose around Obama's neck, and it says rope. And so people have been emailing me, oh, Laurie, have you seen this? And I said, well, that is actually one of the earliest Obama remixes of Obama Hope that I found actually on the stormfront.org website, where I've spent a lot of time, unfortunately, because I was really interested in what racist responses to Obama Hope had been created. So even that now is starting to circulate.
And
so
having a revival with the new
exactly. So that's a whole nother question. I mean, that I haven't even begun to. I need a collaborative team, you know, just assign, and then we could build the layers. But I can't possibly do it all myself because I teach and have a life. But no, that it would be really interesting is to get other people to do that tracing and then build layers on top. I agree.
Well, I think we're technically out of time.
You have
Are we?
15.
Oh, we do.
Okay, super.
Oh, sweet. All right.
Yeah. But you have a question. I asked a question of Donnie already, so I think
Well,
you
I
have a
don't
question.
know if I have a question so much as that, you know, part of what, you know, the problem with visualized data is the same as, in some ways, as ethnographic data in the sense of you've got this thick notebook of stuff, and you've got to figure out a way to sort of translate it in some ways. And part of what you were showing before with those, I mean, I guess maybe this is kind of obvious, but the other thing that kind of just kind of occurred to me is, you know, those graphs that you were showing that were kind of like these web-shaped kind of things. You know, I don't know if people remember StorySpace, which is a software that, geez, 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
You know, that was like hypertext before the web. By the way, those people who were when the web came along, we're basically trying to argue, no, it's not the same thing. It's a different thing. It's different. It's different. But that, if you've ever played with that software before, that's a very writer-centric tool. What I mean is that it's interesting to use as a writer, to create a story for yourself, or as an invention tool, or something like that. But they are, in my view, kind of painful to read as a reader. Right? So the thing about like that chart is useful to you, but it's not useful to me in the same way. You know what I mean? And so that's the challenge in the sense of translating that visual data in a way that's useful to an audience you're trying to persuade, it seems.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. Like, right, like standalone, this is hard to read, right? But like with any visual, you have to like do that call out. Like, here's how to read what I visualized, right? Like in any good research report, you have to do that work. And so I think that's part of it. Like ultimately, I want to like kind of make these like interactive so that people can do that work where you click on it and it shows an image of that. And there's maybe an explanation, like, you know how you add those call-out boxes that you have? I think that's the beauty of web writing right now, is you can get into this stuff and help a reader understand stuff and communicate it in those ways that you just can't do in a print-based article. Like, when I try to write about this research in just print, it's so hard for me to do it because I'm just losing so much. Like, I didn't create it as a print-based study, right? I created it as a multimodal research project. And it's just the translation work is really complex. And the other thing that I really have been struggling with, like these types of views, right? Like this is from an observational activity right here. And so it doesn't necessarily see a lot. It's like I'm seeing a lot of the transactional stuff, and the only reason I can even read in the mediational stuff is because I'm a firefighter, right? And so I see stuff that's going on, and I understand why they're doing things that are implicit and tacit. And I'm like, that's a that. But like, when I see the hand on the wall, is that person actually navigating the wall, or are they just doing that because that's what you do? Like, I remember when I was like a rookie firefighter, like you just do these things. It's like you're doing it, but do you have that knowing that's tied with the doing? And that's the part where it's like, whoa. You know, like you can't get into that just by observing people. So the interviews adds this dimensionality too that really complicates the view of activity, and then you see stuff, and that's where I got like more of like the rhetorical stuff that I think was even more interesting, right? Like the power relations and the stuff that people would do to destabilize things.
I think you're making a really interesting point though, because for me, like, okay, so you're talking about, like for me, I'm trying to use the visualizations to foster the research process. So most, you know, my main concern is to create visualizations that help me. But I have this reaction, right? So I'm doing those little temporal bar graphs, and I have some pie charts, and I've shown them to people, and they're like, Laurie, you're doing pie charts. I can't believe you're just creating interactive digital pie charts. And I'm like, but they're actually helpful. Like, I've actually learned a lot from them,
Right.
but my audience isn't getting anything from them. They think they're boring. They think they're like, you know, 4th grade, you know, digital productions. They're very uninterested in them. So that's a really interesting question when you, to think about, well, so we're creating visualizations for ourselves to foster the research process. But then does that mean that we have to then create a whole new set of data visualizations to make arguments ultimately?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. One of the cool
Yeah,
things
that sucks, Steve.
one of the cool things about the oscilloscope AnsViz is that, so the original idea for that actually came from some work that Donnie did as a grad student, where they were trying to, and it was a recent, what Clay and I have called a researcher-oriented visualization of writing.
Okay. Okay.
And it was exactly the kind of thing that Laurie just talked about. It was a visual for the researcher to foster her own interpretation. And what we did with it here was a slight modification, because the oscilloscope is not meant for researchers. It's meant for people at museum and science centers who are monitoring real-time conversations in social media, and they're trying to foster certain kinds of interaction. And so what they want to know, so at the Science Museum of Minnesota, they have something like 1.5 million blog post threads. At any given time, maybe 1,000 of them are active, and they're trying to moderate them. So what they want to know is, which ones need our attention today? And so this is a way to show, as a distribution, when a thread is doing okay, when it has the kind of facilitative moves going on that would indicate that it's going to be all right for a while longer, or it has some juice. So this is a particular thread Donnie knows very well, because he hand-coded it. It's the chicken thread. And it's been going for 8 years. And you can see that the chicken thread, it's about raising chickens in your backyard. And they ask all of these interesting scientific questions about chicken egg fertilization. And over time, the members of the thread, even if they're not experts, have developed practices to keep it going. And so it's quite a healthy conversation. When you see the facilitators, though, will see other kinds of threads that have all green for a long, long time. And that's probably a thread that either needs to be shut down or needs some attention from an expert facilitator, because it's not seeing the kind of activity. So that's an example, a really early example of how we're trying to transform a researcher-facing view of document-mediated activity and turn it into something. This is still an expert practitioner, but something that they can use to make an intervention.
Yeah, like for mine, I think like the benefit, the takeaway potentially is that you could map, like, you know, describe what you do, right? And then I describe what I do, and I map these out, and I show like your map versus your map. Well, as a literacy like practitioner, I could say like, are you aware of these genres? Like, you didn't even talk about these genres, right? And those might impact your practice in a pretty important way. So I think there's takeaways for different like communities, but it is really hard because it is expert stuff.
Well, on the matter of takeaways, I was very struck by what you're saying about the relationship of knowing and doing, and you gave us as an example your own experience as a junior firefighter. I thought at several points during your presentation of Edwin Hutchinson's incredible book, Cognition in the Wild, because thinking about trying to steer that opening scene, trying to steer a ship in port when there's a challenge that's outside normal operating procedure, then how everybody, expert and novice alike, is learning from each other and how to do it. That's one of the powerful implications here, that not just with the visual of the hand on the wall and the tapping, the hatchet are very compelling. So what are you picking up also about the learning process, not just with veteran and novice, but when even veterans are facing a challenge and then they try to figure out how to solve it, and then extending that to takeaways? How could that be marshaled as a learning tool?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway like that I had was like so obvious, but like the firefighters like were like, we don't really do writing, right? Like, oh, we don't even really have a lot to say about communication. Like, we talk on the radio. Like, you can just listen to our radio communications, and I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, maybe not. I'm a firefighter, too, and I don't really think that way. But, yeah, no, I'll, like, honor that, and let's just hear what you have to say. So when they start talking, then they'd, like, talk about these other things they were doing, and they just say, like, I'm doing work, right? Like, I do work. And the perception is, like, that knowledge work or that communication doesn't really matter to that activity. That's a pretty big takeaway, right, in that community? Because it does. And that's pretty I think that has direct correlations to, like, line of duty death and injury. Because people, like, devalue that work, and then, you know, we don't care about those practices, and then it impacts people communicating on a fire scene. Like, I don't need to teach the rookie, because the rookie just will know how to do it, right? They'll just learn how to do things, instead of, like, think about, like, how we teach writing. Like, in interventions, like, how do you teach a literacy learner a skill and say, okay, you're doing it really good, but you could also, like, work on this now. Like, you could add this component to your practice and now do it in this much more robust of a way. I think that's a takeaway, and I think that has correlations for both of your projects as well. Like, how do we get this out to us, like with the EJ stuff, like to practitioner communities, so that they can do this work on in their own communities and become aware of, like, how do you pull from these multiple databases? Because there's only so much you can do as an expert, right?
Now you get your time.
All right.
Thank you for coming.